Hi, everyone. Today's lecture is kind of a supplement to the chapter on globalization and the environment in the textbook. So I'm not going to go over the arguments in the textbook. That's for you to read. But I'm going to just put those arguments in, or put the topic itself in a slightly different context. So I'm calling this lecture Think Globally and Act Locally, and I'm going to explore the Catch-22s that are involved in doing so. As Young notes in the chapter, environmental issues can be global and they can be highly localized. So for instance, when we look at global environmental problems, these are problems that are likely to affect everybody, no matter their culpability. So if you take the issue of overfishing, well, the fish stock are part of the broader food chain. If you disrupt that, we have potential to disrupt a major source of food, not just for humans, but for anyone who relies on the marine environment for food. So overfishing is considered a global issue. Climate change obviously is a global issue. If you look at just the general risk of nuclear radiation, even though nuclear radiation would derive from, say, a meltdown in a nuclear facility, a wide circulation of radiation could potentially affect everyone. Now, environmental issues can also be highly localized. So if we look at, say, the issue of lead in municipal water, radon gas exposure, exposure to radiation for specific nuclear testing, these issues can be highly localized. So I'm not sure how accurate these numbers are, but in Halifax, the rate of excess lead or readings of lead in the water supply above what is considered safe is about 30–31%. Just a warning, when you go on campus again, do not drink the tap water. It's tested quite frequently, and it quite frequently has lead in it. And if it's above the normal or above the recommended amount of lead, there'll be signs all over the place. It's just safer not to drink it. But that's not uncommon in old buildings or in older neighborhoods with older infrastructure. But this is just an example of a local environmental issue where people are at a higher risk of exposure to an environmental toxin. And of course, this varies by socioeconomic status. So again, environmental issues could be global, they could be local. Now, the solutions to these can also be global and or highly localized. In fact, addressing some global environmental issue requires coordinated activities in many different local areas around the world. For example, if cities were more bike-friendly and had better transit, there'd be far fewer cars on the road each day. Therefore, we can look to cities that have great bike cultures, such as Helsinki, and or transit cultures, such as New York City, and then propose ways to adapt these cultures in cities that don't. So if we look at Halifax, it's starting to have a bit of a bike culture. Los Angeles tends to have horrible traffic, well, as does Halifax. Well, our traffic's not nearly as bad, but if you go to the little anger trap here during rush hour, it gets kind of horrendous, but it's inconvenient. The point here is that if all cities address their car cultures, the amount of fossil fuels that would be consumed annually would decrease. Okay, so a global environmental issue, the amount of fossil fuels we burn, which is causing climate change, could be addressed at multiple local levels around the world. Okay, it's just an example. Now, global environmental issues can be addressed somewhat through international agreements and initiatives such as the Paris Accord, right? So the Paris Accord is a UN initiative to address global climate change. As a UN initiative, it means that member nations have the option to sign the accord, which means that they are promising to take the spirit of the accord and any actual policies that the UN collaboratively creates, and then adjust their own policies to meet the requirements of the accord itself. Okay. So the UN has member nations. Not all nations in the world are members of the UN, and not all UN members have to sign on to an accord. So famously, Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Accord. I think Biden just put them back in. So you could still be a member of the United Nations and not sign each and every accord or covenant or contract or anything like that. So the point here is that to address global environmental issues, we can rely somewhat on cooperation among nation states. Now, the problem with that is that interstate cooperation is highly politicized, right? So anytime you have nation states that are trying to work together, individual politicians have to be somewhat concerned about their individual constituencies. They don't want to sign on to a promise that is going to get them kicked out of office, or they don't want to piss off the lobby groups that got them into power in the first place. Some nation states sign agreements with little intent of actually doing anything. So when you have international agreements, especially at the UN level, there's really no penalty for not following your word, right? So if we look at Canada and how Canada's implemented the Paris Accord, we really haven't. And there's really no penalty for that. You don't get kicked out of the UN. So again, when we have interstate cooperation, which is necessary to address global climate change or any sort of global environmental problem, you're entering into the world of politics. And the world of politics is a world of kind of Machiavellian ends justify the means reasoning. Okay. Now, I'm not saying this shouldn't occur. I'm just saying we have to be realistic about what we can expect out of nation state cooperation in the face of dire environmental movement or environmental issues. Okay, so in my opinion, international agreements have important symbolic importance, but they're not likely to do very much to solve environmental issues. Say the symbolic importance comes from the fact that when nation states agree to do something about climate change, for instance, if they don't, well, then we have environmental movement organizations, individual citizens who can then point to those nation states and say, hey, you said you're going to do this, you're not doing it, and then you can start to pressure nation states to live up to their word. Okay. But ultimately, there's just too much politics internationally for individual states to really care so much about those agreements. Now, another way to address global environmental issues, and even local, but we'll look at global first, is through global environmental movement organizations, as well as networks of more local environmental movement organizations who work together in solidarity or in collaboration. So this generally involves lobbying individual nations or helping nations to develop better environmental policies, or pressuring nation states to meet their obligations, or suggesting to agencies like the United Nations of ways how to best develop international cooperation in the face of climate change or any other environmental issue. So we don't have to rely just on nation states and their cooperation globally. There is a network of global environmental movement organizations or environmental movement organizations that have a global perspective, who also play a role in trying to not only change the nation states' policies, but also to help them change those policies by creating, kind of boilerplate ideas that can then be be changed for each individual nation. So in a lot of ways, at least in my perspective, local or bottom-up solutions may actually have a greater impact on global environmental issues, especially if there are ways to share solutions globally. So there's a lot of environmental movement organizations who work together. They have large conferences that bring different interests together to find out if a local solution in one place may work elsewhere. So if an environmental issue is highly localized, say it is, I don't know, the salination of river water, and that river water has high salt content because of agriculture. There might be solutions to clean that up. There might be ways to desalinate that water before it gets put back in the soil, which would further salinate the soil. So if one place has found a way to desalinate river water prior to it being used in agriculture, those innovations could be shared at a conference, and other farmers in other places or environmental movement activists who are communicating with farmers in other places might be able to share that information. We could look at, I'll leave it at that. So the point I'm trying to make is that environmental issues are best addressed by thinking globally and acting locally. But there are unfortunately some important catch-22s in this thinking. So a catch-22 is basically an unescapable dilemma because of conflicting arrangements in society, which just means that there are certain contradictions that make some solutions either impossible or a little bit more difficult to implement, or even morally hazardous, which is what I'll talk about now. So as I said time and time again, I am not a Marxist. I support capitalism, but not necessarily the type and style of capitalism we have today. But I do think that Marx himself is really useful for characterizing the internal contradictions of capitalism to allow us to discover these catch-22s that I was just talking about. So Marx, in his writing, I won't go into a lot of depth here, says that capitalism is a totality. There's nothing outside of it, really, and that it puts people into contradictory positions. And it also has its own contradictions that will cause its demise, blah, 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 blah. But he suggests that if you are stuck within a capitalist totality, you're going to have these dilemmas that you're not going to be able to really escape, which means that you just have to make decisions, the best decisions that you can, knowing that the outcome of your decisions can never be perfect, and especially morally perfect, which is kind of the theme for today, is that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to be morally perfect when we have a global capitalist, neoliberal capitalist system that is causing environmental problems. Okay, now it's not the only cause of environmental problems, but it is, in my opinion, probably the primary cause, and it's the primary barrier to solutions or to realizing solutions. But it could have potentially the solution built within it, as based on one of my other lectures. So it's true that the globalization of capitalism has increased environmental problems around the world, especially as the production of consumer goods has moved from countries like Canada, the US and the UK, Germany, Japan, to China, South Korea, and developing countries. So over the past 50 years, we've seen a shift of the production of consumer goods from the developed world to the developing world, and we've seen some countries from the developing world become developed countries, such as China and South Korea. Which is not to say that when manufacturing was in Canada, we did it great, we did it in an environmentally sound way, because we didn't. Can't remember why I have that there. So the point is that in a global capitalist system, it is cheaper to manufacture things in countries with little or no labor laws or environmental policies or laws. So one of the major or the reason why we see this outsourcing of manufacturing of consumer goods to the developing countries and to China and South Korea, and less so in South Korea now, they're developing more of a tertiary sector industry or economy. But China and many developing countries that really need capital investment or need to support their economies through manufacturing will subsidize the world by taking on more environmental risk, but also having poor labor laws which allow for greater exploitation of labor or workers. So it's cheaper to manufacture things in countries with little or no labor laws or environmental policies. Therefore, it's in the best interest of corporations to have things made in developing countries or in developed countries that have poor laws. But most of what is being made is for consumer markets around the world, and these markets are driven by consumer demand. Okay, so we can't just look at, say, China and say, well, China's bad because they're making things in a way that's not environmentally sound. It's like they would not be able to make things if we didn't demand them. Okay, so China's economy, probably less so now, but it's still primarily driven by manufacturing, consumer goods for themselves, but also the middle class, and both in the developed and the developing world. Okay, so as long as there's consumer demand, this manufacturing is lucrative. As long as it's lucrative, corporations have an incentive to try to meet demand at the lowest cost to themselves to increase their profit. So consumer demand is sustained by a standard of living funded by an abundance of post-industrial jobs in the developed world and increasingly in the developing world. So white-collar work that is relatively safe, has great pay and benefits, and requires a certain set of skills usually acquired through easy access to higher education. So the point here is, and I'll focus most just on the developed world, but in the developed world, as we've offshored manufacturing, we've increased the non-manufacturing work base, which means you need more higher education in order to get the skills and to enter into white-collar work, and this creates a middle-class lifestyle. A middle-class lifestyle is based on consumerism. It's based on having a particular house filled with certain types of things, having certain cars, certain types of clothing, certain types of experiences, whether it's restaurant experiences or tourism or international travel. Okay, so all these things are driving, or this type of consumer demand is driving our economies. Okay, and our economies then support the manufacture of commodities in the largely in the developing world, but also in China. And China is not a developing nation; it's one of the most powerful economies on Earth. Probably is the most powerful economy on Earth right now. But anyway, so when we look at environmental issues, as it relates to global capitalism, in some ways, it's consumer demand that is driving the growth of the economy, which is then driving the environmental issues that we are now facing. So in a consumer society with a wealth of market choices, goods, services, and experiences, we can develop highly individualized identities. Okay, so we very often, whether you like it or not, in the developed world, we tend to use things to telegraph who we are and to have a certain type of lifestyle that shows people that we're a certain type of people. So we can signal to each other who we are by eating fancy food from all over the world. We can go on eco tours in Costa Rica, drive an SUV so people know that we're outdoor enthusiasts. So you have a certain cluster of consumer items and experiences that become really part of your identity. So your house can be populated with items that reflect the latest fashion trends, and we can send these off to Value Village along with our old clothes as trends and popular tastes change. For the global economy to work, people need to discard their things and buy new things, and they need to have more and more experiences as well, which are consumed in the process of experiencing them. So the growth of capitalism requires the growth of demand, and in this case, consumer demand. But if we think of how to slow that demand, we're actually asking a lot of people to change who they are, who they identify with. So insofar as we do participate in a consumer society, and I'll say it's a middle-class consumer society, a middle-class and rich consumer society, insofar as we do this, the global trade in consumer commodities increases, national GDP continues to rise, and countries that were once poor maybe start to see a massive growth in their middle classes, and thus their consumer sector grows, creating new markets for more growth, which is what we're seeing in China, South Korea, India, and increasingly in some African countries too. We're seeing a growth in the middle class. Now, when we see a growth in the middle class based on consumer society and a growth in consumer demand, when we see a growth in the middle class, we're going to see a growth in consumer demand. People who were once poor or whose parents were once poor, who now have money, are going to want to spend that money in some ways. It's the fun of having some money. But this will expand. This is good because it will expand the global GDP, gross domestic product, or the national GDP, the gross domestic product, which further supports more middle class growth, ideally. But it also means that it puts more and more pressure on production. And when you have more pressure on production, and production is located in areas with poor or no environmental laws, then we see more local environmental pollution, which is going to affect largely poor people in those areas, because you don't dump chemicals or waste where rich people live, you dump it where poor people live. Unfortunately, it's how mean the world is, how mean certain people in the world are to poor people. So we can expect that unchecked, the growth of consumer society, the growth of the global middle class, or even the shifting, middle class is shifting, so it's actually shrinking in North America, it's growing in China, it's growing in India, it's growing in South Korea. But the point is that middle class and rich people have higher levels of consumption because they have more resources. They're driving largely global capitalism. I'm just kind of bracketing it out, finance capitalism, which is also accounts for a lot of the growth, kind of speculative capitalism, which is a whole other nightmare, which I won't talk about here. Anyway, yeah, so all of this requires the exploitation of cheap labor somewhere. So while some countries move from developing nations to developed, then capital investors will find, and corporations will find other poor nations to set up shop, and will incentivize those nations to have low or no environmental policies. So you see environmental pollution, production of goods and services shift around the globe slowly. And basically what we're doing is we're asking poor nations to sacrifice their local environments, and usually the population of the poor people in their population, for our consumer demands in the first world. Okay, so that's one of the catch-22s, is that if you're in the developed world, if you're in Canada, if you're in the US, and if you're middle class or rich, and you are a consumer, you are actually supporting the growth of developing economies. But you're also asking folks in those developing economies to take on more environmental risk. So even if you are environmentally sensitive, you have a low carbon footprint, you don't consume too much, the fact that you are middle class, if you're middle class and if you're rich in these countries, you still benefit from this arrangement. So you get this moral catch-22 where you might really care. And I'm sure all of you care. You don't want poor people to be at a higher risk of catching cancer because their village is close to a toxic waste dump, and that's unbearable. But you didn't ask to be born middle class, you didn't ask to be born rich, and you want to take advantage of the opportunities that you have, but also be globally sensitive. But capitalism makes that very hard, as we'll see in a second. So if you're relatively stable financially because of your middle class status, and I'm just using your as a general population, obviously, you may have time and interest to reflect on how global production, transportation of consumer goods, and their inevitable disposal impacts the natural ecosystem. So being middle class affords you, a bit of a luxury to think about environmental issues, whereas if you're poor, these are not priorities. When you're poor and you're in poverty, being immediately safe is more important than long-term safety. Okay. Yeah. So even if you're, say, middle class in the developed world and you're trying to promote the idea of buying locally and trying to address your carbon footprint and maybe become an activist and are working to change environmental laws and maybe even economic international laws, these are all good things. The problem here is that if we, I can't remember what my next slide is. Yeah, so I missed that one. So this is my middle class slide. Now the problem is that if all middle class people around the world said, you know what, this is right, we need to reduce our consumption, we need to buy locally to ensure that we're not having commodities shipped around the world, and shipping is a huge and has a huge environmental burden. If everyone did this, if we all reduced our consumption of consumer goods and experiences, the global market would collapse and people in developing nations would lose their jobs, the national economies would collapse, and there would likely be a massive growth in human suffering and misery. There'd probably be civil wars all over the place. Okay, so some people buying locally, some people addressing their carbon footprint is great. But if everybody did it, the whole system would collapse because our economic system is based on the production of consumer goods and their consumption. Okay. Now, if the global economy contracts because people minimize consumption, the economies of countries in the developed world would also contract or collapse altogether. There'd be far fewer middle class. Should be something on that slide, but there isn't. There'd be fewer. So if the developed world saw a contraction in their economies, there'd be fewer middle class jobs, unemployment would increase, fewer people would be able to afford to get university degrees, the government would have less tax money to collect, infrastructure such as roads, ports, airports, universities would be difficult to maintain, and thus the transportation of goods would likely become more expensive. Without a diverse pool of consumer goods, we would not easily be able to build and signal our own personal identities in quite the same way. We'd be different people. There's a lot more slides here, but they didn't show up. Anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, so the greatest challenge of addressing global capitalism and the environment is balancing the reality of the global capitalist system with the real and very serious environmental problems that we face. So the question is, can we have a green capitalism that allows more and more people to become middle class around the world without destroying the ability of the planet to sustain human life? Okay, so that's the challenge, and it's because of these catch-22s. But the answer, I really don't know the answer to this question about whether we can have a green capitalism that helps grow the middle class while also protecting the planet in such a way that we have sustained human life. So I think the question itself allows us to really reflect on issues of global justice in relation to environmental and economic issues, because I think they're not separate things. So it's easy for us to think that it's obvious that we should do everything we can to prioritize the health of the global ecosystem over the economy, because you can't have an economy if Earth doesn't sustain life, right? So are we supposed to be just to all humanity by prioritizing global environmental health to ensure the planet can sustain human life now and in the future? If so, if the answer is yes, the world economy and political order may collapse. Then there'd be no chance to work together globally to address climate change. By not protecting the global economy, in other words, we're not likely to reverse climate change and would likely suffer the probably negative consequences of it. So we're already in this position where climate change is happening, and I truly believe it's past the point of no return, but we might be able to change the intensity of it. Who knows? We might be able to change it altogether with some technological innovations. But if we say, okay, we just have to prioritize the health of the global ecosystem, if we put all our energy in that, the world economic and political order would really collapse. We can't do that. So we have to protect the global economy in some way. And if we didn't, climate change is going to keep on moving on anyway. So we'd still, if we wanted to prioritize a global environmental health, we're already past the point of no return on that, in my opinion, which means that, that we're going to suffer the climate change no matter what. But if we don't have global coordination, it's going to be worse than if we did. Okay. The other option is trying to balance environmental solutions with the need to maintain an economic system that unfortunately has high environmental costs. But it also provides the resources, such as funding for science and technological innovations, and a relatively stable global order that may address the negative consequences of things like climate change. So even though global capitalism has a very high environmental cost, it does produce enough of a stable global order because each nation state that is involved has an incentive to maintain some order in order for global trade to continue. But what we do know about capitalism is it does create a surplus of capital or profit, which gets reintroduced in the economy through research and development for technology. So by maintaining a highly environmentally costly system, we have a chance to create or to maintain or to have funding for the technological innovations that we need to actually address climate change, to address the high cost of that global capitalism puts on the environment. Now the problem there is, can we find viable solutions quickly enough? If not, we may suffer the negative impact of global climate change anyway, which will surely impede, if not collapse, the global economy. Okay, so again, this seems really dire, and I promise I have a happy ending to this, not to climate change, but just to some optimistic ideas and how we might best move forward. So we also need to address the uneven. So anyway, yeah, so within this context, we also need to address the uneven risks posed by global and local environmental problems, or sorry, I'm not reading this well because I didn't write it well. We need to address that environmental issues and problems are inequitably distributed around the world. Right, so even though, yeah, we're all going to be affected by climate change, if we look at local issues, it's mostly poor people who are going to be affected, who are affected and will continue to be greatly affected and disproportionately affected by environmental problems. So even though environmental racism is real, the fact that some racialized groups are more exposed to environmental toxins than other groups, it is better, I think, to broaden the scope and talk of environmental inequalities. So environmental inequalities means that some groups are more negatively impacted by environmental issues than others, and this is generally because of socioeconomic status. So insofar as that a society is racist, people of a denigrated race will likely have a higher rate of lower socioeconomic status and thus will face higher levels of environmental problems. Okay. Now, the reason why I like to use the word concept of environmental inequalities over environmental racism is not to overlook the fact that race matters, but to also recognize that there are many different types of people and groups of people who are overly or disproportionately exposed to environmental toxins or environmental issues, and that they matter too. And by using environmental inequalities, we are still capturing and recognizing, and have to recognize, that racialized groups who experience discrimination and disrespect in particular societies are also going to be highly affected by overly disproportionately affected by environmental issues. Okay, but we have to look at this as an intersection of race and class, because anybody with money has the potential to move away from danger, regardless of one's race. So having a lower socioeconomic status or class position also means that you're not actually responsible for most environmental problems at all. If you can't afford to be a consumer, if you're likely to have a low you're going to have a low carbon footprint. You're also more likely, unfortunately, to live in poor housing and to be exposed to higher levels of chemical toxins, whether it's lead from paint, old pipes, or old infrastructure, or having to rely on cheap processed foods loaded with chemical additives. So this is another one of these, moral ironies that those people who are the least responsible for environmental problems are the most likely to be affected by them, and sometimes not even by their own awareness, right? So if you're unaware that there's lead in your water, you're not going to be able to move away from it. Whereas if you have resources, if you own your own house, if you have a newer house, there's not going to be lead in your water. You'll have filters. You'll have copper piping as opposed with no lead solder in it. You might be in a newer neighborhood where where the infrastructure doesn't have lead. Okay, so poor people are more likely to work in dangerous jobs and are also more exposed to environmental toxins at work. So whether you're in the developing world or the developed world, if you're poor, you're more likely to experience environmental inequality. Now, if you're poor, especially in places without universal health insurance, you're less likely to have health insurance. You're more likely to die from illnesses when you're sick. And this is why, in part, the morbidity and mortality rates in poor neighborhoods and communities in the developed world are so much higher than in more affluent communities. So again, the point here is that when we look at global issues from a global, or environmental issues from a global and a local perspective, there are inequalities throughout, okay? And as I'm sure many of you are aware, that we're sensitive to this. We don't want to see people who are already suffering suffer more, and we'd like to have a world that is more equitable. I would, and also more equitable in the economy, but also equitable in exposure to danger from industrial pollution, basically. So global capitalism, which is the only system we now have, puts us in a terrible position. If we want to be just to all humanity and have a more equitable global economy, we may very well sacrifice humanity's future because we will not be able to coordinate globally the large-scale changes needed to address major environmental problems. Global capitalism requires some people to be poor. So some people to be, and for some people to be unemployed, you need what Marx called a lumpen proletariat. And some countries have to have lower environmental standards in order to attract capital investment from the developed world. So for most of us, this is morally offensive, yet if you're middle class or above anywhere in the world, you benefit from this, right? So, but even though it likely counters your own moral system, right? So global capitalism is inequitable. It requires poverty. It requires unemployment. If you have a certain number of people unemployed, it keeps wages down, which keeps the economy going. And the global capitalism does create good wealth. It does create middle-class lifestyles and support middle-class lifestyles, which are very comfortable. But most people have certain moral positions where they want everybody to be treated equally or equitably. We want everybody on Earth, whether they're poor, rich, or middle class, to have the capacity to develop their skills and to have a life that they want. But global capitalism is based on the fact that you can't have that. So you can't have a capitalist system where everybody has equal footing. Okay. And the point here is just that we're in this totality with contradictions where it's difficult, if not impossible, to act out your own personal morality or your own cultural morality and have pure global justice, because pure global justice, if enacted, would collapse the whole system. We would need a whole new economy, not based on capitalism, in order to have pure equity, okay? And no one has come up with a viable non-capitalist system so far. communism doesn't work very well. It has its benefits in some ways, but it doesn't work. Which is not to say we won't come up with something. Now, another catch-22 that I've talked about here is that if everyone acts locally to reduce consumer activity, then there may not be ultimately enough global order to sustain coordinated activities to address environmental issues, and there'd be far fewer resources available to fund these activities even if we could. So to reduce consumer activity too much is to slow down the economy. Okay, so the other option could be to have a different type of capitalist economy that's not consumer-based. That's possible. So what are the solutions? How do we deal with these catch-22s? My feeling is we don't really have to deal with the issues at all. That we need to be realist and pragmatist, I think. Okay, so these catch-22s exist because of global capitalism itself. Okay, and because global capitalism is totality, the resolutions of the contradictions don't go away, or the resolutions can't coexist with capitalism itself. But realistically, capitalism's not going anywhere, and it's certainly not going to go anywhere at a speed that we would need it to go and replace with something else in order to address especially global climate change. So global coordination to address environmental issues is simply politics as usual. So if you look at things like the Paris Accord, it's a symbolic document. It has real-life policy changes on the ground in different countries who choose to usually haphazardly adopt certain policies consistent with it, and that's fine. Okay, that's just politics, and this is if you've taken a political science course, this is just a realist perspective on international relations. We can't expect nation states to all of a sudden stop being suspicious of each other or to stop prioritizing their own nations over other nations. When negotiating environmental accords or protocols, these negotiations on environmental protocols, agendas, and stuff like this follow the same political strategies that nation states employ when negotiating any international treaty, whether it's a human rights treaty or an economic agreement. So while these are highly suspicious, they're flawed, they're self-serving, they're inequitable at the nation state level, they happen to work good enough to make a viable and secure global order. So that is necessary. Okay, and this is really, I think, important. That even though I really don't like politicians. I really don't like global politics. I just think it's just seedy and gross. I think it's insincere, but it does seem to work good enough that we have a relatively stable global order. And because we have a relatively stable and viable global order, we have enough coordination among nation states to get some things done. Yeah, or at least to remind us that we need to do things. So I'm not saying global arrangements are completely unnecessary. I'm saying they are necessary, but they're limited. So we also need to recognize that there are people and groups all over the world in lots of communities and locations working to address local and global environmental issues, and that people are creative and cooperative. And even more so than we are duds and selfish. So we can all be selfish, we can all be cooperative, depends on our mood, but there's a lot of cooperation in this world, and there's a lot of selfishness too. But there are tons and tons of really cool, creative, cooperative people who are inventive and innovative and who share knowledge. And quite honestly, I have a ton of faith in people's ability to cooperate. So if you think about just food, people all over the world help each other to grow, store, and cook food, right? This is farming, whether on a small scale in your garden or on a large scale if you have a farm, is always cooperative. You learn from your neighbors. You learn what grows in your region. You learn the climate, how to grow certain foods for your climate. Some climate seasons are longer than others. And the best way to know that is just to talk to people who are already doing it. And all over the world, people are addressing local environmental issues, and they're sharing knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. And I do think that that matters. I think the more people who are experimenting with alternative lifestyles, the more we have models of behavior, and that is where economies grow from. So, the economy is just basically everything we do to be clothed, to be sheltered, and to have food. That's what an economy is. It's a division of labor. And global capitalism is a formal arrangement. There are laws and contracts and stuff that support it. But if you think about the world 3,000 years ago, well, there was a global economy. There was global trade 3,000 years ago. There were contracts and stuff like this, but there weren't all these international arrangements, and it wasn't a capitalist system, so it was more mercantile, I guess. So there were people who were trading goods and services. There were people who were speculating on money and stuff like this. Even 5,000, even 10,000 years ago, there's been a lot of trade, and we get a certain benefit by having a highly coordinated global economy that is supported through treaties and laws, local laws and international laws, national laws, and stuff like this. But the economy is just the sum total of people living their lives and the division of labor. So the more people who are working together, being creative, trying to address environmental issues, even if they're big environmental issues and the cooperation is technological cooperation or scientific cooperation, all of this is already going on. And we already have lots of new knowledge. We have a lot of restoration of old knowledge, and all of these things matter. So I am actually hopeful that our scientists will make discoveries that will allow for technological innovations, that will allow for us to pull carbon from the air and store it somewhere useful. I have hope that the same thing will happen for the energy sector. And I know that even on a small scale, I have hope that people will work together to address environmental inequalities, environmental racism, and they do so because in the past they've been successful already. So if we look at the recent past, there's been tons and tons and tons of instances, I guess tons is the wrong metaphor, many, many, many instances of people who are collaborating, inventing, innovating, and addressing environmental issues, whether those are small-scale issues or large-scale global issues. And finally, I just want to point out that the solution, again, is just likely to trust that we're working on many solutions and that humans have a track record of overcoming natural limitations. I mean, that is the human story, is that ever since we evolved these big brains and we're starting to talk with each other, we've come up with ways to overcome our biological limitations, but also to adapt to our environments. So humans are super, super incredibly intelligent. We have our dark side where we are unaware of the consequences of our actions very often. So we have a large environmental footprint. But I think that if we look to the past, we probably do more good than bad. I must be in a good mood today because normally I wouldn't say that. But anyway, so we have these catch-22s, these contradictions that capitalism creates that make it difficult to solve large-scale and small-scale environmental problems. But within that, we have pockets of really incredible creative people who will come up with solutions. All right, that's it for today. Sorry, my slideshow totally got messed up, but anyway. Have a good week.